Hello and welcome to What's the World Coming To? Today, what I'd like to talk about is something that obviously is covered very broadly within the news, and understandably so, and that is basically the United States' military action, along with Israel, in the bombardment of many installations and facilities within the Iranian Republic. And there have been many prophecy teachers who have kind of stepped up and said they see this as a fulfillment of a particular specific prophecy about the nation of Elam, which they say basically is equivalent to Iran or ancient Persia. And it basically in that prophecy, it speaks about the collapse, the destruction of Elam and the events that will take place. And so they say basically what we're seeing is Jeremiah 49 being fulfilled before our very eyes. Now, generally, I am kind of supportive of those approaches, and I have spent quite a bit of time ever since the invasion started looking closely at Jeremiah 49 and saying, is it really something that is a fulfillment in our current events that we're seeing around us, or are we kind of bending the interpretation a little bit to fit into our narrative? And the thing is, I think that's kind of a danger. One of the things I've observed over the years is there are many people who have become skeptical about end times prophecy, or if there isn't any such thing, because they've been subjected to a lot of interpretations that basically taking biblical text and looking at things that were happening currently and saying these are direct fulfillments. And oftentimes, as the world scene would change very dramatically, they would come to the conclusion that this is really kind of a lot of spinning of yarns rather than being something that is predictive of what the future looks at. It creates kind of a lack of trust in what's being said, to the point I've had some people say, I just don't believe that the Bible prophecies are relevant or have application to either today or the end times. And I think that's unfortunate, but I think it's an understandable response, because once you've been told that we're going to be raptured out of here within any moments, and then those moments go by and turn into years and decades, it's very easy to become skeptical. But I think that part of it is that we fall into this trap of wanting so badly to make things fit into our narrative, what we think is the biblical narrative, that we kind of get carried away with ourselves and see more in the text than we should see. So what do I think about Jeremiah 49? Well, I may be giving you a hint, but to put it in a kind of a bigger context, Jeremiah 49 is a prophecy against a place called Elam, which was the southwestern region of modern Iran today. It's not the entirety of Iran. It certainly was never considered to be Persia per se, but it was a unique ethnicity that's still there. There is actually a province that's called Elam in Iran today, and they are basically the inheritors of that ethnicity. And it's a unique place because they have their own unique language, not spoken very much anymore, replaced a lot by Arabic. But nonetheless, they have a language which we have no known origin for it. There's about 100 of these languages around the world where we don't know where they came from. They seem to have just kind of come of their own origins, and we can't link them to any other language group or language root that we know of. And Elam is one of these. They have a unique language. Even into New Testament times, they would speak a unique language different from what the Persians or the Arabs were speaking. They are definitely not an Arabic people, and nor are the Iranians. In fact, Arab genealogy basically makes up only about 20% of the Muslim world. So that's a little bit of a misunderstanding or a misappropriation that people make many times. But other than the fact that sometimes we make wrong assignments, the bottom line is we have to ask our question, is Elam, who is speaking of Jeremiah 49, actually the same thing as what we're seeing with Iran today? And it's funny because, Jeremiah 49 is one prophecy in the midst of a whole series of prophecies. We call it the oracles against a nation. It starts in chapter 46 of Jeremiah, and it goes all the way through chapter 51. And there's about 10 different ethnicities or nationalities that are mentioned there that are going to be judged by God, for the most part because of their participation in the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 597 BC. So Jeremiah the prophet, before that event took place, began to speak and say, God is going to judge you for your part in this. Now, we don't have any historical evidence that links Elam of that time, of 597 BC, directly to the conquest of Jerusalem. Islam. But what we do know is they had been conquered previously by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians would have forced their warriors, particularly their archers, because that was one thing that they were really well known for, is they had these very gifted archers, very talented. They were the best of their soldiers, as the text said, and forced them really into serving with the Babylonian forces against their enemies. And so that may be the reason why they're listed here, but we don't know for sure. I can't prove that one way or another. That's just reasonable speculation, but speculation nonetheless. So what we know is that when we see the reference to Elam, we know it is to some degree related to the country of Iran today, but certainly is not representative of the entirety of the Iranian nation or republic, and certainly wasn't basically the core of the Persian Republic. But secondly, it says their archers of Elam were going to be destroyed. They were going to be broken. And many prophecy teachers say, well, the archers refers to the missiles and the drones that are being used, which are really believed by many to be the heart and soul of the current Iranian Republic's military efforts. And so they basically say, see, the prophecy said that they're going to be destroyed, and we're in the process of watching many of those armaments being destroyed. So they say basically that's the best of their forces, as the prophet says, and therefore we're seeing that being fulfilled. Thirdly, it said they would be destroyed by their enemies from every side, and then it says they will be destroyed completely. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because how literal do we take that? We know that Elam as a nation was defeated by the Assyrians, is defeated by the Babylonians, is defeated by the Persians, and ultimately conquered by them, eventually became under the occupation of the Greeks, and then ultimately, not during the Roman period, they became a separate area where they were included in a kingdom called Parthia. So, I mean, it's a lot more history, but it was the Parthians who governed over this area in New Testament times, especially when we find the reference to Elam in Acts chapter 2 amongst the nations that appear in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. But I think more specifically, they still maintain that that ethnicity and that language, and there were a large percentage of Jews that had settled in that area and been converted to Judaism at that time in that area of the world, as there were up until the Iranian Revolution, where most of them had to flee. But he goes on to say that he's going to destroy them completely, and I think right now we look at 90% of the population in Iran are not supportive of the current regime. So is it referring to, if it's speaking about today, is it referring just to that pocket, that 10% who are supporters of the Iranian regime, or is it talking about the entirety of the nation? Again, it's not very specific and very clear. Ultimately, it may be talking about just the destruction of all their military forces, but we'll get into that a little further. But he goes on to say that I will scatter the people of Elam to the four winds, and they will be exiled to countries around the world. Well, actually, that only happened in 1979 when the Ayatollah Khomeini became the supreme leader. And it's kind of interesting. You may not know much about the Iranian Revolution in 1978 and 79. It was pretty profound. Basically, the Shah of Iran, Shah means king, basically, in the Persian language, the Farsi language. The Shah was overthrown by a coalition of communists and jihadists. Basically, you had what we call a red-green revolution. After 3 years, the communists were completely wiped out by the Shiite jihadists, the Ayatollah's forces. They thought they could control the Ayatollah. They ended up being wiped out by the Ayatollah, and the Ayatollah became the supreme ruler, which is the way their government is set up now. They have a supreme ruler in the form of the Ayatollah, and that's why it's so important to have an Ayatollah chosen. They're in the process of trying to select a new Ayatollah, which will probably be the son of the previous Ayatollah, although I've just heard reports that he was caught up in the bombing and lost a leg and may not even know where he is right now, may not even be very viral. But the point is that they believe within Shia Islam that they have to have a religious leader heading the country. That's unlike places like Turkey or the rest of what we call Sunni Islam, which most of the world, about 80% to 85% of Muslims around the world are Sunni Muslims. Iran, they are Shia Muslims. They make up a very minority part of the Islam community, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But the bottom line is that the Sunnis believe that they should have a caliph, which is a king, a secular king, who basically follows the leadership leadership or the guidance, the counsel of the Quran and the spiritual leaders. But Iran is quite different. They said the guy on top, the number one guy, needs to be a religious leader. And he's basically, the Ayatollah means the guiding light, the one who guides us. He is a person who has to be the eminent spiritual religious figure within their society. And so the first Ayatollah was a guy named Ruhollah, who was basically reigned for about 10 years, and then he died. He was followed by Ali Khamenei, the guy who was just assassinated, and now his son is the one who's scheduled to take over. Some say he's already been appointed, and to what degree we don't know, because he's not going public. To do so would probably mean a death wish, so we're waiting for all of that to play out, because even though it looks from the outside there's a great deal of chaos going on, there's still a lot of command and control taking place within the Iranian Guard and the Iranian government. So before I get too far ahead of myself, but basically he says that the Elamites will be dispersed, exiled around the world. And again, that happened in the Iranian Revolution, especially those who were associated with the Shah of Iran, those who were Christians and Jews. Many of them were forced to flee the country because it was made clear that they were not welcome, and many of their leaders were being arrested and executed very quickly. And so they had to flee the country for their own safety, especially those who had been westernized. In other words, that embraced a lot of Western culture. And at that time, under the Shah, whose father became the first Shah, or the empowered Shah in 1925, when he seized control of the government. And then in 1953, he was made the absolute ruler by the U.S. and the British, because we wanted to control the oil interests in the country. As a consequence, he has always been viewed as being a Western puppet and not somebody who authentically represents the right of the Iranian people. And the whole reason the revolution took place was because he had become so extremely despotic. He had a secret police that was kidnapping people and executing them and taking away civil rights, and really offending the religious community, because he was pushing the westernization of the culture to know the kind of success that he saw around the world. And that's where they, basically were banning the hijab and all those kind of things. It created a lot of chaos and confusion and stress. And unfortunately, the U.S. government, under the policy of the Carter administration, was so confused and multifaceted. There were some who supported the Shah. There were some who were against him because he didn't allow for civil rights. And as a consequence, we were incapable of rendering him any aid in holding on to his position. And he was quickly overthrown. He developed cancer near the same time and had to flee the country. And that's where it opened the door for first the communists, then the Ayatollah, the red-green coalition, if you will. And then very quickly, the green coalition wiped out the communist coalition, because in the end of the day, the religionists, the Shiites, those who followed the Ayatollah, were much more committed and much more willing to lay their life down for this ideology, this religious cause, than were the communists. And that's one of the things I would say is a caution for what we see happening in America today, because we see again the red-green coalition, where the neo-Marxists within our country are aligning with the Islamists, like we have Mondami in New York City and other places. And the reality is the Islamists usually come out on top because they know no limits to the extravagance, the extremists they will go in order to really promote their ideology. For them, it is not just life and death, it's eternity. Whereas communists don't believe in eternity, they just believe in the here and now. And so when you put those two against each other, the philosophical and the practical expression of that always favors the Islamist. So keep that in mind when you think about the dynamics we see happening over in the Middle East right now. But what's really interesting is 4 million Iranians ended up leaving Iran and settling in the West. And that's why you've seen the large demonstrations of pro-Iranian forces. Interesting, we haven't seen any of the pro-Palestinian forces. But nonetheless, we've seen a lot of pro-Iranian demonstrations in the United States, because they're hopeful that Iran will have a regime change, and with that regime will come freedom of expression and their opportunity to return to their fatherland, which understandably they love and care about. But basically, when it goes on in the prophecy, say, I will destroy its kings and officials, people say the strike that happened by the Israelis where, 40 different leaders were killed, and that number may be any place from 60 to 80 now that have been wiped out. Well, either the king would be the Ayatollah, the leading figure, and all of those who are supporting him in the highest positions of leadership, and they look at that and say, see what's happened, it's being fulfilled just as he said it was going to be fulfilled. And yet we come to this whole idea of destroying the whole regime. And if you just limit to the regime that's in power now to being destroyed, we have to understand that that represents about 1 million people. And these people are what we call devout Shia, and they have a unique kind of Shiaism, Shia being like a sect of Islam, and it's unique even within the Shia community that has its particular own taste and flavor and style in the country of Iran today. But it's made up of 1 million people who are devoted to this idea of the Ayatollah being in charge. They're the people you'll see wearing the women wearing the hijabs and the men with the interesting costumes, and they're crying and moaning and travailing in the streets over the death of the Ayatollah. While on the other hand, you have the remaining 8 million Iranians who seem to be rejoicing and celebrating in the streets. But we have to understand that that 1 million are the ones who control almost everything in the country. It's interesting because they have the IRGC, which means the Iranian Republican Guard Corps. This is a group of people who are committed to maintaining what they would call the Iranian Revolution. And that's what happened in 1979 when the Ayatollah took control. They called it the Iranian Revolution, which they saw is starting with them and then spreading out around the world. And that's why we find that Iran has the Quds Corps. Basically, they have this overseas efforts of planting insurgencies, if you will, militias. They would call them freedom fighters, but basically they're Islamic jihadists in places like Hezbollah and Yemen and different places around the world, and probably have sleeper cells all over the United States and Europe as well. But their whole goal is to take the revolution that started in Iran in 1978 and 79 and spread that around the whole world. And this ties into their whole religious philosophy, which I'll explain in more detail in a few moments. But of that 1 million people, there are 600,000 who are card-carrying members, if you will, of the Iranian Guard. And what's striking about those 600,000 is they're a lot like, you can almost draw a parallel between them and the SS in Nazi Germany. They are the elite ideologues who believe this to the depth of their being. They've been raised in it. You think about this, they've had almost 50 years to basically incorporate their theology and their practice and their vision for the future into these people, and they are drop dead serious about it. And as a result, they've also managed, when the Ayatollah came to power, he very cleverly not only gained control and support from the religious community, which had been oppressed under the Shah, but he also began to take those people and put them in places of power. Particularly, they control every aspect of the economy. They control all of the banking systems. They control the scientific world, the medical world, the energy world, the construction world, telecommunications, the ports, the shipping, major manufacturing and mining are all basically led by people who are proven faithful members of the Shia contingent of the Iranian Guard. And so they may not be soldiers in that sense, although most of them have served in some form of military duty, but they all have been really raised within this idea. And interesting is that 200,000 of those men are the armed militia. Now, the IRGC is different than the military, but the military has been taken over in its total leadership by people who are IRGC. So you have to understand that they have managed to take control. They have the reins of every aspect of that society and that culture. And so they have also benefited from being at the top of the feeding chain. And so there's a lot of things involved here. Not only is there an ideological commitment to seeing worldwide Islamic revolution, but there's also a benefit of being at the top of the food chain. These are the people who benefit most directly, financially and otherwise, from the Ayatollah's regime and his rulership. And they are not people who are in a hurry to give that up. Now, This is one of the things that makes a regime change, as it's spoken of, so very, very difficult. And the United States' position, Israel's position, in fact, most of the world's position in regards to Iran is most countries, other than China and Russia and North Korea, would like to see a change in regime. They can't agree what that looks like, but they realize that what is there now is a perpetual problem for the rest of the world because this commitment to create chaos and conflict every place they can find an open door. And they've really bankrupted their economy to some degree because they've taken all of their money that they've received, even the money that Barack Obama gave them, the billions he gave to them, and they've used it to fortify Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and everyone else who is on the same agenda with them. And as a result, they've taken those resources, they've dispersed them bountifully to the people who are in leadership positions, but also they've made sure that they enabled things like October 7th, 2023, the invasion of Israel from Gaza to take place. The Iranians planned it. They basically supplied it. They paid for it. And they were the ones who probably designed the attack itself. So, it's something that they've been engaged in. They've been responsible for killing thousands of American soldiers. They're the ones who built the roadside bombs that we saw all over Iraq, taking out American soldiers and so forth. So, this is something that has been going on for 50 years. It's something they're deathly committed to. And so the idea of uprooting them is not easy. That's why I kind of had to chuckle when President Trump was saying he invited them to lay down their arms and he would give them amnesty. Well, he might give them amnesty, but I'm not sure the Iranian people will because they have been brutalized by this administration. I mean, to a level that most people have no concept of how cruel and brutal these people have been. Everything from picking up women off the street at night and raping them and killing them. And it's just a horrific organization that feels like it has total power and total immunity from any of the consequences of its actions. And that's why when people began to demonstrate during the Green demonstration or later on, the most recent ones, they've had no trouble just simply sending their troops out and opening up fire on them. And these are the Iranian Guard militia, their riot police, who are basically commissioned to put an end to it, and they do. They have no qualms with just simply machine gunning down crowds of people, even though most of the time it was women and children who were the front of the line. They mowed them down nonetheless. They had no trouble doing that. And so you have to understand that they feel, I kind of like the SS felt, that they were doing a good thing by eliminating Jews and gypsies and Poles and anybody else they thought was a subhuman. And that's the same attitude you have. We have permission. We're doing a holy thing by killing these people who are revolting against the supreme leader. And so you have to begin to understand the mindset that we're dealing with here and why the actions that are being taken right now by the United States are really irreversible and absolutely overdue. Iran has been at war with the United States since 1979. They've openly declared it when they basically captured all of our embassy workers and held them for 400 days before they were finally released. I mean, this is something that's not new or unique. It's not something they're getting over. It's not something they're going to change. This is how they see the world, and this is how they interact with the world. And they really do believe that they have God's mandate and blessing upon them. So there's no holding back from their efforts. They'll go all the way. But some of the things I think become a little less clear in this prophecy are things where he says, for example, I will set my throne in Elam. And we have to ask the question, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that Christ is going to come back at his second coming and set his throne on someplace in Elam? The Bible says it's going to be in Jerusalem, so that obviously can't be it. Does it mean that he's going to have his rulership or governance over that place, that suddenly Christians are going to become the major representative in the country and they'll take control and run a Christian empire, a Christian kingdom? Or maybe it just simply means there's be this tremendous revival in the land, which certainly we can pray for. And I know many Iranian Christians have been working for decades to accomplish. It's certainly not the second coming, I don't think, but maybe it is. And last of all, some people just simply say, no, it's basically saying God's going to place judgment. He's saying, I'm going to put my government, my control over this country, and I'm going to judge them because of their sin. What is really interesting, though, is that he says something to Elam that he doesn't say to the other 10 countries or ethnic groups that are judged by God in Jeremiah 46 through 51. Elam is the only one to whom he said, I will restore the fortunes of Elam in days to come. What does that mean? He's going to restore their fortunes. And this is where historically Christians have interpreted this as in the millennial kingdom, and this after the second coming of Christ, he's going to lift Elam up. Why he doesn't say that to any of the other countries? I mean, he doesn't do it for Egypt, he doesn't for Babylon, he doesn't do it for Ammon and Moab and so forth and so on, Philistia. He doesn't say that to any of them, but he does say it to Elam. And it's always been a kind of a peculiarity. Why is God going to restore Elam? And that's where some people are saying, well, this means that the Iranian country is going to become a great and powerful country in the Middle East for good. They'll have a Christian governance and they'll be following God's moral law. That would be wonderful. Please don't misunderstand me. I wish I could look at that and say, I say exactly that's what it's saying. But traditionally, most interpreters of Jeremiah 46 have seen it being fulfilled in two different ways. Number one, Elam was totally destroyed about 40 or 50 years after Jeremiah gave the prophecy. So Jeremiah was speaking of something to come in the future, and all of those 10 nations that he lists in that series of prophecies were all destroyed within 50 years of the prophecy is giving. So it was fulfilled in the most literal sense. And so we can point to Jeremiah 46 and say it's actually a prophecy that was literally fulfilled. And basically, it's also understood that because of Acts 2, talking about the day of Pentecost, where there were Elamites that were there who were Jews who got converted and went back and planted the church in Elam. And there was a church, there has been a church in that region ever since. Now, it's never been a majority population. They've always been a minority. Most of that time, they were left alone up until very recently, where the Ayatollah decided that he needed to crush Christianity. And it literally became illegal to convert to Christianity. And many pastors were arrested. Some of them were executed because of their effectiveness. So most of the evangelism that's taken place has been in house churches in secret, or it's happened through, especially over the internet, because everywhere you look, there is a satellite dish, and it's illegal to watch Western shows, but there's not really any way that they can stop people from doing that if they have a satellite dish. Of course, you have to have a permit to have a satellite dish, and they have to get that from the Iranian Guard. And if you have one that's been not given a license for, then they will come and take it. But what some friends of mine told me, that afterwards you go and pay a bribe and they'll give you back the dish and you can put it back up, because really they use it just as a way of extorting more money from the people. And that tells us essentially the Iranian Guard has been corrupted by money, which isn't the first time that's ever happened in human history. So many people look at that and saying, well, Acts 2 is really the fulfillment that God's going to restore his governance over the land by the church being planted in Elam. Could be. I know it doesn't fit in my mind perfectly, but it sounds like it could be because of some other things we'll look at for a moment. But let me talk about something else and go back to the current situation. I pray that God would free the Iranian people from the regime that now controls it, because as I've said, it is a very wicked and evil regime, and I think it's empowered by the demons of hell. And part of the problem is, my wife pointed this out to me one time, that when people like the Hamas leaders, Soleimani or Ayatollah, and these people are killed, these are people who I think are demon-possessed, and the demons just simply find a new host. And in fact, when we look at the change of Ayatollahs, it's just basically the demons are just going to go possess another vessel who he will use to promote his agenda, because Satan's agenda ultimately is to reap death and destruction wherever he can, and particularly to use men who become sold to evil to attack those who are seeking to promote righteousness in the earth. So all of that kind of like becomes a zero-sum game, because they aren't always cast into the pigs and run off the cliff. And even the pigs that ran off the cliff, we have to wonder, where did they go to find a new host? And let me tell you, Jesus made it very clear that when a demon is cast out, they will go around trying to find a new host, and they will return with 7 times as many demons in order to reinforce and fortify their position, so it isn't as easy to extricate them from the controlling place they have in that individual's life. And that can spread within a whole culture. And so I'm not reluctant to say that when I look at the Iranian regime, the IRGC, I believe it's basically demonic controlled, and that most, if not all of its leaders are certainly demonically oppressed, maybe even demonically possessed. And that's where their brazenness and their aggressiveness and their hatefulness comes out of that demon focus that controls their thoughts and their lives. But let me talk a little bit more about what's unique about the Iranian Shia beliefs. They call them Twelvers because the Iranian Shiites believe that there were 12 imams and that the 12th imam is the one who will open the way for the return of the Mahdi. And the Mahdi is the Muslim name for basically their Messiah. They don't see him being the son of God because Islam clearly says that God has no son, but they see him as being this world leader who will bring judgment upon the world for its sins and its unbelief, primarily its failure to accept Islam as the true religion. And secondly, he will set up a governance where the whole world will be governed and controlled by Muslims. Now, part of this comes out from a split within Islam in the 7th and 8th century over who was going to be the leader. The Sunni Muslims said that he should be somebody who was elected by consensus. The Shias said, no, the leader is somebody who comes by heredity. Now, so the idea is that they've passed this idea of being the leader of the Shia organization, religious movement, from one spiritual leader to another. And since that wasn't necessarily always father to son, the thing became a spiritual sonship, a spiritual adoption. And the end of the day is the Shia saying that it should be the most prominent religious or spiritual leader within the Shia community who leads everything, not just the church or the religion or the mosque, but he rules over the entire governmental system. And this is, significantly different than what we see in the Sunni Muslim world. For example, in the country of Turkey, which was the former Ottoman Empire, which we'll touch on in a moment, they have a prime minister, Erdogan, who doesn't claim to be a theologian or a religious leader. He is a political leader who is living out the agenda of the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, which basically has been behind a lot of the things that we see in Palestine. We see with Hamas, we see it in Egypt, we see it in Syria, and even with ISIS. They're all spawned from this same organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a radical jihadist extremist movement within the Sunni Muslim religion. So, they're two, one's vanilla, one's chocolate, one's strawberry, one's pecan, but they're basically made of the same substance when it all comes down to it. But the Sunnis have a historical grievance, and I want to emphasize this because grievance is kind of a mindset that people have. It's kind of this idea where you have a chip on your shoulder. You feel like you weren't treated fairly. You're not being given the respect that you're due. And the Shia Muslims feel like they are the redheaded stepchild in the family that is not favored by the leader of the family, the leader of the home. And the Shias have felt like they've been treated like second-class citizens ever since Iran was converted to Shiism in 1500s. I think 1501 was the year, actually. And I wouldn't say they were converted. Basically, the guy who conquered it turned it into a Shia kingdom. That became the favored and prominent religion. And what you find is whenever there becomes a prominent and favored religion by the leader, many people will change their religious faith so they can get on the gravy train and be the beneficiaries of that. And that's been true of not only Christianity, but also Islam. Every religious system has always had those kind of people who seek to enhance themselves by basically converting to whatever is the majority faith in that country at that time. But they've had this historic grievance against the Sunnis, and they feel like they are the superior form of Islam, and the rest of the Islamic world needs to come to its senses and understand its leadership. And that was really the psychological impact of the revolution in 79, because what they believed is this is the first step in not only fulfilling their vision for the future, but also bringing the whole Muslim world and eventually the entire world under the control of the Shia religion, the Ayatollah, and ultimately delivered into the hands of the Mahdi, which is their version of the Messiah. And what's interesting, when we talk about the Mahdi or their Messiah, the Shias believe, and particularly this particular branch of Shias, believes that it is their responsibility to prepare the world for the coming of the Mahdi. In other words, they have to bring jihad and return the Muslim world to the true faith in Islam, which is not the watered-down Sunni version, but the hardcore Shia version, and that they need to bring that all together, bring all the rest of the world under the banner of Islam. And the question is, well, how do you do that? And it's called international jihad. They believe that everybody should be a Muslim or should be eliminated because they aren't Muslim. And I put it this way, I said that the first goal is to unify the Muslim world under their leadership. Secondly, to conquer, convert, or kill all the Saturday people, because Israel, being as successful and prosperous and powerful as it is really a spitting in their eye. They find this a huge insult that in the middle of a land which once belonged to the Muslims, now occupied by Jews of all people, and who overpower them and keep on defeating them, that is untenable to them. And they feel like they have to become focused on destroying that first and foremost, because they see Israel not only as being a religious abomination, but they also see it as a foothold that the Western world has to westernize the rest of the Muslim world. And so this is an internal conflict all over the Islamic world. Where are they going to be true to their roots and true to the vision of Muhammad and the early leaders of Islam, or are they going to be untrue and simply submit to the prosperity and the advantages of a Western world? And these are deep conflicts. I mean, families are split right down the middle. I know of, I remember talking to one young man in India, converted to Christianity. His father took him out, tied him to a tree, and then whipped him until he was unconscious and blood was running down all of his back. And he took salt and rubbed it in his wound and then left him there to die. He managed to escape and made it to a Christian community where he was studying the Bible at that time, preparing for ministry and to be a missionary. But it was quite a harrowing story. And he said it's not unusual, because if you convert to any other religion, particularly Christianity, you will be killed by your family members as an act of honor and to take the disrespect off of their heritage. So basically, this idea is not so strange, but Israel is basically, it's so abominable to them. They go crazy. They're so worked up about it. And the grievance, not only against their lack of appreciation within the Muslim community at large, but also the insult of Israel as being not only present, but being successful. Because one of the things that's taught in the hadiths, which are supposedly the hadiths are the teachings of Muhammad that weren't written down, but were written down later on, they became really the foundation for the legal system for Sharia law, which is kind of a repetition, because Sharia literally means law. So when you hear people say Sharia law, you have to understand that is the only law that you should have. And they come into a country and want to set up their independent Sharia courts within, whether it be London or Texas or wherever. The idea is that they pay no more attention to the laws of that country, the Constitution. They are faithful to the laws of Islam. And within that, it says that any territory that's once been occupied or owned by Muslims has to remain in their control. And if it's taken from them, the rest of the Muslim community has to be committed to retaking that one way or another, whether it's buying it back or it's killing the people who live there. It doesn't really matter in the long run, because they have to restore that property back to their control. And so that's really a part of the grievance you find with the modern radical Islamic community today, is that so much of the territories which once were under their control, like Spain and parts of Italy and Eastern Europe, you go across the board, and Israel in particular, or even parts of Africa, they feel like that's their responsibility to do whatever they can to spread Islam, but also to recapture those territories that were taken from them by, whether it be the British or the Germans or anybody else for that matter in human history, and certainly by the Israelis. They also feel that once they have taken care of the Saturday people, which are the Jews, they need to get rid of the Sunday people. That we even need to be conquered, we need to be converted, or we need to be eliminated one way or another. But we're next in line. First the Saturday people, then the Sunday people, and last of all, anybody else who's an idolater, which would include the atheists, by the way, that anybody who's not a Christian, a Jew, or Muslim are not monotheists. They usually worship multiple gods, which makes them an idolater, and therefore they need to be conquered, they need to be converted, and they need to be eliminated if they don't come along. So we have to understand that they have this whole view of society that's vastly different. Their mindset is not just something that they've adopted recently, like most people in America change their views on things based upon the latest tweet that they read. But these are people who have been trained and indoctrinated this for generations. Their fathers, grandfathers, and it's all an honor culture. So you don't dishonor your relatives. You do everything to maintain the honor and respect. And so part of the problem of regime change, even at this point, is that there's a lack of unity even with those who are opposed to the Ayatollah. I mean, there are probably 30 to 40 different groups who would like to vie for power. There's a lot of talk about having the Reza Pahlavi, the current crown prince who's spent most of his life in the United States, to have him return and create a coalition government, create a kind of a monarchical republic, kind of like the idea they have in England and other places in Europe. He obviously, hopefully, doesn't have any inclinations to regain the same kind of despotic power that his father had and his grandfather before him. But nonetheless, some people say he could be a unifying factor. He probably is the most well-known and supported guy that could be in that role. But the question is, you have to remove the opposition before you can ever begin to think about that. And there's a real problem, because the chances of the Iranian people being able to survive without some kind of outside intervention is pretty small. And one of the things I think is very unlikely that we're going to see any European or American boots on the ground, and certainly not Israeli boots on the ground. And that's one of the things I think that we realized in the Iraq war, was that unless we had troops on the ground, we couldn't control the ground. And the problem was we were not completely committed. We wanted to get in and out as quickly as we can. And so we didn't really even take the time to create a transitional government that could stand its own 2 feet. And so as a result, we paid a lot of blood and treasure and have little to nothing to show for it. And so I don't think that with America, the United States is going to make that mistake again. I certainly don't think it's going to happen with any of the people in the Republican Party. The Democrats would just as soon, give them what they want and pretend like they don't exist and ignore the problem. But at the end of the day, is we have to realize that the IRGC controls the police. They control the military. And the only way that anything is going to change, as it did with the Shah, was when one of the parts of the military flipped and decided to support the regime change. And that hasn't happened yet. It doesn't seem likely, simply because none of the military branches are controlled by anybody other than those who are fiercely loyal to the IRGC. And as we saw, with the Arab Spring some years ago under Barack Obama, that when these countries rebel, when there are popular rebellions, they aren't looking to start a democratically elected government. They're looking to start to put in place a very autocratic rulership, whether it be religious or secular, but that's the only thing they feel comfortable with. And so the likelihood of them creating a democratically elected republic is not very likely, simply because it's not part of their cultural thinking. It's not the way they look at the world. And that's because they don't have a biblical worldview. And that's so hard for so many people to understand today, that the reason we have our style of government is because the founders drew from a biblical worldview of man and government and what its role is supposed to be. That didn't exist anyplace else before America, and it doesn't exist in most of the world today. That's why strong men over and over again always end up being the leaders of these countries. And you can look all over the Middle East, and you won't find a single truly democratically elected government. Even Turkey, which has a prime minister who's elected, but it's pretty clear that his margins of winning his elections indicate that these are probably not honest and fair elections, and he rules much like a dictator. So regime change can only be accomplished with boots on the ground, and I don't see that happening. But let me tell you what is my biggest objection to seeing Jeremiah 49 fulfilled in this moment that we're living in, and it's called Ezekiel 38 and 39. You see, there we're told that Persia, the word actually in Hebrew is Parsa, which was the name for Persia at the time, is one of the members of the Islamic coalitions that comes against Israel in that great battle of Gog and Magog. But what's also important is it's not that battle, or that coalition is not being led by Iran, it's being led by Turkey. Meshech, Tubal, Togarma, and so forth. This is all Turkey. These are regions that are part of the country of Turkey and were part of the Ottoman Empire. And it is the vision of Erdogan, the prime minister in Turkey, to restore the Ottoman Empire. And he's always working to try to win influence over the rest of the Arab world, that he might be seen as the key leader in that event. He's not the first. I mean, there's been a series of leaders, whether it's been in Egypt or now currently in Iran, but also in different parts of the Islamic world, that have said, we want to work towards being the leader. Nasser in Egypt had that idea. Sadat in Egypt. Egypt had that idea, and certainly the Ayatollahs have had the same mindset. It's this kind of a dream of Islamic leaders to be the one who unifies the whole Islamic world. Because again, you have to understand that this informs their politics. Their politics are not basically about power and control and influence and riches like we have in this country. Their politics informed with the idea of being the leader of the Islamic people, which are destined by Allah to rule over and govern the rest of the world. That informs their politics, and that becomes the strategy by which they approach life. And I think part of the other thing that we might got to kind of throw in here on the side is that China cannot afford for Iran to become an oppositional government to their interests because of their dependence on Iranian oil. And so I saw today that China is sending 2 of their cruisers into the Red Sea to kind of help keep the peace, and Russia is sending some as well, because basically the person who's been hurt the most by Donald Trump through Venezuela and Iran are the Chinese, who get a significant portion of their oil to run their war machine and run their economy from the Iranians. 80% of Iranian oil right now goes to China. So these are interesting things because we see all of these elements pulling together, which could be, many people say, well, this is going to lead us into the battle of Gog and Magog. I actually have a different thought about that. What I see happen is this. I see that Iran does not necessarily have a regime change. In fact, even the Trump administration were saying that they were willing to work with anybody who would help to change the dynamic between Iran and the rest of the world. In other words, they would even support an Ayatollah who would say, let's stop exporting terrorism. Let's stop working on building a nuclear bomb. And you might say, what is their goal in having a nuclear bomb? Well, Rafsanjani, who was one of their previous prime ministers, who was killed, in fact, in that initial strike against the Ayatollah and his men, had said at one time that Israel was a one-bomb country. And there's debate about whether or not he was suggesting that Iran build a nuclear bomb so they could destroy Israel. But the truth of the matter is, you just have to drop one nuclear bomb in Israel and the country is done. That's why the Israelis are so fervent in their efforts to destroy the Iranian power and force, not just because they support Hezbollah or the Hamas or the Houthis or anybody else, because they know that they are a one-bomb country. That's only going to take one nuclear device to put them out of the picture. And when they boasted in the negotiations, which went nowhere, that they had the fissile material ready on hand to make 11 nuclear bombs, you can see how that became an existential threat and an existential crisis. So I hear all these rumors that people put around. These things are posting on Facebook or in Instagram or especially on TikTok. And there's just a whole lot of nonsense is being purported by bots and by the Iranian government and the Chinese in order to basically win the public relations campaign against the destruction of Iran. But the whole point is that it's something that Israel doesn't have a choice in. And the United States has suffered as well under the Iranian terrorists. And so therefore it serves everybody's purpose. And ultimately, if they got a nuclear bomb and they had ballistic missiles that could reach all the way to the United States, they can already reach Europe. And all they have to do is reach the United States. We would find that all they have to do is hit one city and create so much destruction, it could really cause the whole deck of cards to collapse. But I find that Iran's military capacity has to be diminished. That's not an option on the table for any of the democracies of the West, and particularly for the United States, and even more particularly for Donald Trump. He seems to be one of the few people who seems to see this thing clearly. You may not like him, you may not disagree with him, but he's absolutely correct in saying that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Of course, Obama said that, Biden said that, everybody said that, but they've never done anything about it, and he is the first one who has. But also, they have to be diminished so their reputation as the people who are going to push the worldwide revolution, international jihad, that reputation has to be destroyed. They have to be incapacitated to the point so that they become basically embarrassed, humiliated in front of the rest of the Muslim world. And that's the only thing that's going to work. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't still hold this passion, because I think these people would die rather than give up that identity. That's something we have to understand, that people will lay down their life just to save their identity, because that becomes your purpose. And without a purpose, you have no life. And so basically, this is something I don't think will change in the minds. That's why I think in Gog and Magog, they may be diminished militarily, but when there's a chance to invade Israel and wipe it out, they'll join up. They just won't be the guys leading it. They won't be the ones who are in charge. And that's the hard thing for them to swallow, but they'd rather be part of the party than not be invited to the party at all. That's the greater shame. Because, and the reason I say this is because what Ezekiel tells us that Israel will be living at a time of peace and safety. They'll be thinking that, basically it says they're in unwalled cities. Now, Israel is one of the most walled places in the country. I mean, there's a wall, a fence, a gate, a barrier everywhere you go in that country. Even if you want to go in the grocery store, you have to go through a security check. I mean, it is the most security-focused country in the world. And basically, it says they're going to be in a place where they're not worried about it anymore, that they feel that war and conflict is no longer part of their life. You have to understand the Israeli mindset, and I think I do to some degree because I have some close friends over there, and they are so weary of war. They've lived their entire life with war. One soldier told me, he said, we all have PTSD. We live with it our entire life. So they're a small country, a small population, a tenth the size of Iran, and yet they have been in one war after another ever since they declared independence. And everybody has lost friends and family members. It's personal. And so they are prepared, they are hardened, they're battle ready and all of those things. But the thing, if you talk to them, they'll tell you, we want peace. We just want to live our lives. We want to see our children grow up. We want to see our grandchildren. We want to see them happy and healthy and prosperous. We don't want war. We're so weary of it. And that's one of the really sad characterizations we find in the media. And again, I think this is fomented by the Islamic world and the communist world and the red-green coalition that they have, is to make Israel look like the one who is the warmonger and who's creating all the problems. The idea, if we just get rid of Israel, the problems will go away. And it's surprising if you look on social media how often that is actually the argument that's being made by many people. But it's ludicrous, it's fallacious. Israel has done more than anybody else to try to bring to an end this conflict, and every agreement they've signed with the Islamic world has violated. So now they have the Abraham Accords, and I hope that they hold. I mean, I'm not betting against the home team, if you will, but the sad thing is you just know that biblically this is going to end in one great conflagration. I refer to it as the death of Islam. That's mean the battle of Gog and Magog, because I think once and for all, the God of heaven will repudiate Islam as a religious system, and it'll give way to, I believe, a new kind of Judaism, a kind of idea of Jews now become the favored religion. And that leads to the rebuilding of the temple during the tribulation. But nonetheless, that's part of my view of those things. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. But I think that you have to ask the question, of course, is where is the United States in all of this? And it's important for us to keep in mind the U.S. is not mentioned in the Battle of Gog and Magog. There are some references to the young lions not being involved. Some people suggest that's Israel. We don't know for sure. Again, because we don't want to overread the text, I don't mind saying this is a possibility, but I can't tell you it's a certainty. And I wish more of my peers would take that same kind of carefulness when they talk about these things. But anyway, basically, we find that the U.S. somehow is not a participant. And how is that going to happen? Well, there's a variety of ways that we can self-destruct, if you want. I mean, if we continue to inflate our economy the way we do by borrowing trillions and trillions of dollars. I remember when Barack Obama said that when the U.S. debt had gone from $4 trillion to $8 trillion under George Bush, he said he should resign in shame. He should be impeached. It was the worst thing in the world a president could do to inflate the economy that much. And then we look at what the Democrats have done since then, and Trump has done as well. We've inflated that kind of, so we're hitting $38 trillion in debt, and it's going up. Part of the goal to drive down interest rates is to reduce our debt payments because it's consuming a larger and larger percentage of our economy. Right now, do you know that 70 million Americans collect Social Security of one form or another? Like, we're talking about almost a quarter of the entire population is receiving money from the government. They're on the government dole to one degree or another. So you have to understand that we are spending ourselves into oblivion. All that needs to be is a change of leadership. We find that Donald Trump is ruthlessly and relentlessly resolute in his effort to push forward his MAGA agenda. And what happens when he's no longer in that position? Will there be that same resoluteness? You see, even within the MAGA party, there's a unity around Donald Trump. There's not a unity around any of the other leaders. And I think it's going to be hard for whoever follows Trump to be able to maintain that kind of unified government. The Republicans are many of them are as unreliable as the Democrats are. Well, let me put it this way. The Democrats are pretty reliable. We can count on them being nonsensical in their positions because all they care about is how to get themselves back into power, and they will do everything and anything to get back in power. For them, it's all about power. They'll say, we'll do all the damage we can now so people will kick these guys out, and then we'll come back and we'll fix it when we get around to it. But they don't ever fix it. They just patch it over with a Band-Aid and let the infection spread. But nonetheless, what's going to happen when we have a leadership change? Because it's going to come in just a few years. And will there be that same resoluteness? I don't know. I don't think we can count on it. You add to that the moral decadence. I often point out the issue that God is not going to wink forever at the murder of the unborn, to the sexual immorality that's being promoted on so many levels. And it seems to be a pushback coming right now, but it's not at the level of being a moral outrage to the level where these cockroaches who are promoting all these ideas run for a hiding place to get away from the light. The light is not that bright. The Christian church is horribly compromised morally and spiritually and theologically on so many levels that until there's just a widespread repentance within the church, we're not going to see an outpouring of the Spirit in the nation. And that's one of the things, if you study revivals, what you find is they always start within the church, where the church begins to repent of its sin and begins to cry out to God. And then God begins to cleanse the church, and then he begins to speak into the culture, and the culture begins to come under a wave, a tsunami of the Holy Spirit's power and transformation. I don't see that in the church. I see some heartening things that are happening in various places. I'm encouraged by seeing so many young people who seem to be making public professions of faith in Christ. But we don't know what the long-term impact of that is going to be. Are they going to be the seeds that fall in the rocks and sprout up with joy, but as soon as hardship and persecution comes, they fall away? Well, the only way you can know is when hardship and persecution and difficulties come to see whether or not they're going to be sustained. But what we find with much of the church is not only have they not been persecuted or suffered and had to endure and dig down their roots deep into the ground, but they also have become basically choked off by the weeds of this world. We have become so much part of the cultural dynamic, and we've absorbed so many of their value systems in our preaching, in our operations, in our view of missions, and the way that we do music. I mean, Christianity in this culture has been completely, almost 100% co-opted by the cultural values of a non-Christian system, an ungodly system. And so that in itself can mean that God removes his blessing. And that's what I think is one of the sad things, that he blessed America. God has blessed America. And I don't think most Americans are even cognizant of that fact, that we are reaping the blessings of the faith of past generations. And there comes a point, and that's why I've talked in the past about looking at the history of Israel and Judah. In the biblical times, we see the same pattern being followed in our culture. You know, history doesn't repeat itself. Basically, human nature repeats itself. Human nature will do the same thing, and prosperity and power tend to corrupt nations, and they tend to forget about God. They become less and less dependent upon him, and they begin to rely more and more upon their supposed resources, riches, and power, and those things can disappear in a moment. One of the things you find from studying ancient history is that almost every great power fell immediately after it reached its highest pinnacle. And I fear that we are at this highest point right now. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, without question. China is back on its heels. It's energy dependent. It's got all sorts of conflicts within the Communist Party, within the leadership. They've gotten rid of like 50 of their key leaders, particularly in their military. Much of their technology, especially in this last round of fighting, has proved to not be in the same par as the United States. All of these things are going on, and I don't think that China is going to ever be able to be a major player until we find the Battle of Armageddon. That comes at the end of the tribulation. So I'm not so much concerned about them, but we have become basically so many sectors of our economy and even our educational system have sold their soul to the Chinese and to the Islamists because they've taken their money. Qatar has spent at least $6 billion that they've donated to educational institutions around the country to start basically schools for the study of Middle Eastern policy, which is another way of saying teaching and promoting Islamic agenda. We find the Chinese have done the same thing by creating these Confucius Institutes, which are starting to be shut down. But we bring in millions of Chinese students every year who are obligated and given permission to come to the United States because they're obligated to operate as spies within our country. So this kind of craziness that goes on with our inability to resist the gifts and the largest of large amounts of money will probably ultimately be our undoing. And even to the point where I see that anti-Semitism is becoming a stronger and stronger force. I mean, most people who don't even know who the vice president is, much less the president, will be anti-Israel because that's all they hear on TikTok. And so we have these dynamics developed that are really, really existential problems, but are not getting addressed adequately. And particularly, most Christians aren't praying that God would somehow reverse the trends. Because I don't think our demise is inevitable, but I think that unless we humble ourselves and pray and seek his face and confess our sins, that our sins need to be forgiven. We need to see how bad our sins are so that we can confess them and be forgiven. And then he says, I'll heal your land. So I think we're seeing a little bit of a respite because we've seen Christianity being more prominently expressed in our culture. But you find at the same time it's being expressed, the hatred towards Christianity is at an intensity level that's just really staggering, something I would have never imagined 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. But here we are today. Well, to ultimately say that when we look at the future and saying what's going to happen in the Middle East, I would encourage you to focus your attention on Turkey, and particularly its current leader, a man by the name of Erdogan. That's spelled Erdagon, but Erdogan is how it's pronounced. And he's essentially the dictator of Turkey, elected that way by questionable means. But nonetheless, we find that he envisions being able to restore the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the whole Middle East for 400 years, from 1516 all the way till 1918, where they lost control after World War I because they sided with the Germans and the Austrians against the Europeans, and they lost control of that whole area. But the whole point was that that's been the goal, to restore that. That's the vision. And I think that that's what's going to be the thing that really causes the Battle of Gog and Magog to take place, because whoever the leader of Turkey at that time will see as the opportunity to recreate the Ottoman Empire. And so that's kind of what I see happening. Focus on Turkey, focus on Erdogan and things that are coming out of the news there. It's interesting because it's hard to get news from that part of the world here. If you have cable, you might be able to, online you can access, Sky News, BBC, Deutsche Welt, the German. One of my favorite is the I-24, which comes out of Israel. All of these countries, especially I-24, has a much more accurate representation of what's going on with Israel and the nations around them. So sometimes it's in English. Sometimes they have, they put it in captions so you can read it because it's in Hebrew. But it's really a slice of the story that we don't get on this side of the aisle. We're still looking for Nancy Guthrie while this war is waging. And so as a result, we don't really get news that is pertinent to the moment. But again, I would just close by saying, one of the things I've found is a danger is where we try to bend prophecies to fit into events, when I found in my experience that when events take place, they seem to mimic the Bible 100%. Let me give you one closing example. When I was back in the 70s and I was teaching in a Bible school, I was explaining to the students as we were going through biblical prophecy, I was explaining to them how that at that time, Iran was under the authority of the Shah. This would have been like 73 or 74. And they were an ally of Israel. They were the most westernized and advanced, and one of the most prosperous countries in the Middle East. And most people who visited there said it was a wonderful country to visit. They really enjoyed it, especially for a Westerner, right? And yet I said, I don't know what happens, but he says, even though they're probably a close ally selling oil to Israel, something's going to change. And I said, I don't know what it is, because they are going to eventually be one of those forces that are going to come against Israel. And that's where in 1978 and 79, particularly when the Shah fell, and suddenly Iran went from being an ally of the United States and Israel to being one of our most, if not our most dedicated enemy, I looked at it and thought, oh my gosh. how it happened so quickly. Overnight, the dynamics of the world changed almost instantaneously. And I'm telling you that when we look at events, we say, okay, how in the world could Turkey head up a coalition that would march against Israel? And the answer is that God can change things in a moment. He controls the flow of history, not our politicians and certainly not our well-wishers. It comes when God does it. Anyway, I hope that was not too overwhelming. There's a lot to digest. This is not a simple issue. God bless you and go in His grace.